Hello and good afternoon. My name is Stephen Hines and I'm an extension educator with the University of Idaho. I'd like to welcome you today to From the Ground Up, Cover Crop Solutions for Western Farmers, the second in a set of sub-regional conferences of the Western Cover Crops Council. I'd like to introduce the next speaker. Lauren Golden is a program assistant with the Western Sarah grant that helped funded this project, and she worked on a survey project as part of this. She is a PhD student with Boise State University.
Okay, thank you all for having me today. As Steve said, I'm Lauren Golden. I'm a PhD candidate with Boise State University. And a couple years ago, I started working with the Western Cover Crop Council to help put together a survey of Western farmers and their use of cover crops. There has not been a survey of the scale for this large of a region. There was a similar survey that the Midwestern Cover Crop Council put together, but it really targeted the Midwest and the Northeast and had very little representation from the West. So we wanted to embark on understanding where we were at with cover crop use in the West, knowing we, as Jeremy said, have such a vast region, a variety of cropping systems, and quite a variety of climate systems to look at. So today I'm going to talk about that survey we conducted and the results we found. So first I will discuss the methods we used to gather that survey data, and then we'll just jump right into the results, looking at the rate of cover crop use for the West, what motivates cover crop users in the West, what are the biggest barriers in the West to cover crop use, and then we'll talk a little bit about cover crop policy as well. So we conducted a Qualtrics survey. So that was an online survey with around 60 questions. So it took farmers about 10 to 12 minutes to do. So we greatly appreciated all the farmers who were willing to take their time and do that survey for us. We launched the survey in April of 2020, and it ran till the end of June. And we targeted Western farmers. So essentially how we were able to capture Western farmers was one technique. We did a large scale Facebook ad, which targeted the states in the West, which Jeremy's map showed that all those blue states, as well as Alaska, and it also includes the islands, Hawaii, Micronesia, and Guam. So we specifically ran that ad to reach audiences in those states, and with characteristics in their Facebook profile that indicated they were either a farmer or had interest in farming or agricultural type terms. And then we used our Western Cover Crop Council network to reach agricultural listservs and various organizations through the West. And essentially we asked those organizations if they were willing to share the link to the survey and then send that out to their farmer network. Luckily, we got 894 usable responses for this survey, which is a very good response rate for a survey of this size, not only for the region we were trying to reach, but also for the amount of questions. So jumping right into some baseline data that we were able to gather was how many farmers in the West are using cover crops. On the left-hand side, you can see the Western region. Pie chart is for the entire survey response. And that has a value showing that 72% of farmers said, yes, I have used cover crops, or no, and only 28% said no. Essentially, we simplified it and just asked a yes/no question. Have you ever used cover crops? So this could include people who have used it once, and this could include people who have used it numerous times or every year. Now, with any type of survey, we know there's always going to be some sort of bias. So we have to take that into account, knowing that farmers who are going to likely click on a cover crop survey are farmers who are more likely to use cover crops. So we know going in that there's going to be some sort of bias with this data. But all in all, with our high response rate, we can conservatively say that yes, over 70% or close to 70% of Western farmers have indicated that they've used cover crops. And on the right-hand side, I honed in on the Pacific Northwest, which in this case was just Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. You can see I had a high response rate for those 3 states. I had 626 respondents. So in general, we had a lot of respondents from the Pacific Northwest. We aim to get representation from every state, but that was hard to achieve. So you'll see that in some of my data where I have high numbers for certain areas and lower numbers for other areas. But it's nice to see that the Pacific Northwest had a higher value overall. 79% of farmers indicated that they had used cover crops, as opposed to only 21% saying no. I'll hone in on some other frequencies. We did get a high response rate for the islands, which was good. I wasn't expecting to get such a good response rate from them, but Hawaii, Guam, and Micronesia, they indicated that 78% of those farmers use cover crops and only 22% said no. And then just to show another West Coast state, we have California, where we didn't get quite as high of a response rate. You can see only 33, but it is above that magic number of 30. So we can still use that data to glean some information, indicating also that I believe it's 82%. My camera's hiding it right now, but said that they have used cover crops or do use cover crops. So in the end, these pie charts are at least a good baseline data for the Western Cover Crop Council to understand where we're at in the West. As Jeremy said, we're looking to increase the number of people planting cover crops and increase those plants being grown in the soil. So this is good data to go off, and we're looking to keeping that number going upwards. So another question we asked was how many acres you planted in a series of years. And the first year was 2016, 2017, 2018, and all the way to what you anticipate planting in 2020. And the nice take home with this line chart is to simply say, yes, the numbers are increasing. We can see that we can see a nice spike in 2017 in terms of increasing acreage. The first year we collected data for this was 2016, so they indicated just shy of 30,000 acres were planted, and then anticipated for 2020 was an upwards of 25,000 acres more. So all in all, that's a good number to see an increase of, and we all know that every workshop or agricultural conference you go to, cover crops are a presentation or a topic of discussion. So we know that over the last few years, knowledge is spreading about cover crops, interest is spreading, and more farmers, it's becoming more of a common practice. So in general, just a good number to see that we're increasing our acreage. Now we asked a series of motivation questions. We wanted to know what motivated farmers in the West specifically to their use of cover crops. Now we asked a series of questions on a 5-point Likert scale to strongly agree to strongly disagree with these motivating statements. So essentially it indicated whether a farmer was highly motivated to use cover crops or if they were less motivated. So do you strongly agree or strongly disagree that cover crops increase soil health? Do they control weeds? Do they reduce runoff? Do they increase soil moisture? Do they reduce soil erosion? Do they support pollinators? And do you think they help farmers deal with climate change? So let's look at the results of that. So you can essentially see on our, this is a motivation chart just for the Pacific Northwest farmers. On my axes, I have one indicating strongly disagree, which again is someone who's not going to be highly motivated to use cover crops if they are strongly disagreeing with many of these statements, with the 5 indicating strongly agree. What's nice to see is that all these blue lines are definitely tilted towards the strongly agree. So that indicates most of these farmers are, whether they've observed these motivating statements on their own farm, or if they just know it to be true because they've heard about it for many, many years. It's nice to see that overall, most farmers are agreeing or strongly agreeing with these statements. Now, the top 2 motivations are increasing soil health and reducing soil erosion. The least motivating was helping farmers deal with global climate change. But again, it was leaning towards the agree to undecided on the scale. I also have this same graph for the entire Western US, and it's relatively the same. Increasing soil health and reducing soil erosion remain the top two. So not much shifts with that overall. And it's just nice to see what's motivating farmers, specifically in regions and throughout the entire West. Now, motivations are nice to know about, but barriers are more important to us as we're looking to increase the number of users. And in order to increase the amount of users and their success rate, ag researchers and farmers as well, we're trying to overcome some of these barriers. So in a similar fashion, we asked on the survey, do you strongly agree all the way to strongly disagree that any of these are barriers to you when you're using cover crops? So are cover crops hard to establish? My growing season is too short. Cover crops are expensive. Cover crops reduce yield in my cash crop. Cover crops increase disease. I don't have time. I lack equipment, and I have inadequate knowledge. So again, if a farmer is saying strongly agree, in this case, it's going to mean that these are seen as barriers to their use of cover crops. Whereas strongly disagree is going to mean not many of these are barriers to their use of cover crops. So looking at the results, one thing to right off the bat notice is that my axes are the exact same. I strongly disagree being a 1, with the 5 being strongly agree. And in comparison to the motivation graph, you can see that all my blue lines have significantly moved towards the strongly disagree and disagree side of the scale. So that's good to see that it's clear that most farmers recognize the motivations. All those lines were shifted over to that side of the scale. And then these barriers, although some of them are barriers, we see that they're not significantly shifted over to, hey, yeah, these are huge barriers for me. So it's nice to see that a lot of these farmers are responding either undecided or disagree with many of these. But it's still important to know, okay, what are our top 2 barriers? And in this case, for the Pacific Northwest, we see too expensive and lack of knowledge being the top 2 barriers. And on the bottom of the graph, we see growing season is too short and cover crops increase disease being the lowest barriers, or the lowest barriers. So all in all, it's nice to know that the first 2 are something we can perhaps do something about. Here we are today, sharing knowledge about cover crops, and I'll talk next about policy, which some of these other speakers after myself today will also dive into. So it's nice to see that the barriers are possibly 2 things we can tackle. As opposed to a growing season is too short. Yes, that's a little more challenging, and yes, there are solutions, but a little bit different depending on where you're located and what type of management you can do to incorporate changes. But as you can see, as we move down, it's hard to establish as 3rd, not enough time, reduces yield in cash crop, lacking equipment, and increasing disease on the bottom 3. Now I'll just show these exact barriers for the Western region, and not much changes. The top 2 are still too expensive and lacking knowledge. Again, 2 things we can possibly tackle. The only thing that really switches is lacking equipment and reduces yield in cash crop. So the barriers stay pretty uniform when we look at the Pacific Northwest or the entire survey sample. Now we did ask, following that easily fillable section of the survey where we said strongly agree to disagree, we did ask an open-ended question right after that saying, are there any other barriers to cover crops? We anticipated farmers to mention other barriers we hadn't listed above, but it's interesting to see that 618 farmers were willing to fill out this open-ended question, which usually you see a large response drop in these open-ended questions. But farmers were willing to reiterate, again, those top 2 barriers, knowledge and cost being the largest barriers. And then we have time and labor. I'm gonna move my camera slightly. We have time and labor, water, timing, and sourcing seed. So sourcing seed was one we've heard about, but it was nice to see that that did pop out of my 27 categories that I coded, that popped up as one of them. And one thing that was uniform about them, many of them specified, I'm having trouble finding organic cover seed, or whether just cover crop seed. So that was an interesting barrier that we didn't add, but we know it's there, but it's interesting to see that it is a significant barrier for us to consider. Now I'm going to shift gears and talk about cover crop policy. Research has shown that many cover crop users do not use the federal cover crop cost share program. Many of you on this call may or may not know about it. Essentially, the USDA through NRCS offers a cover crop cost share program, and it's run through EQIP, which stands for Environmental Quality Incentive Program. And essentially, incentives is the main word there. They're trying to incentivize farmers to use conservation practices. Now, this image here is in the dead zone of the Gulf of Mexico, where non-point source pollution from nitrogen, phosphorus, and soil essentially travels down the Mississippi and its neighboring tributaries and creates this huge water quality issue that not only is an issue for human health, water quality, but also marine ecosystems. Now, agriculture is the #1 contributor of non-point source pollution, which is why EQIP over the last 5 to 10 years has heavily pushed cover crops as the main tool in our toolbox to help deal with non-point source pollution. Essentially because economically, it's a lot easier to deal with non-point source pollution on site rather than looking down at this large water body, this dead zone, which can be larger than the state of New Jersey in some summers, or areas of Chesapeake Bay has received significant water quality issues. It's a lot cheaper to look at how can we deal with the avoiding this non-point source pollution from leaving the farm, rather than dealing with it when it's become so large that we really can't economically fix this problem in such a manner. So again, cover crops are seen as one of the biggest tools to help stop that non-point source pollution. Again, as we know, non-point source pollution cannot be tracked. It cannot be tracked to individual farms. We can't go, okay, this particular farm, we need to work on your conservation practices because we're seeing this much runoff. We can't really do that. So as a whole, we're looking at cover crops as a way to help solve that non-point source pollution on a large scale and have a big impact. So similar research in other parts of the US has specifically looked at whether farmers participate in these EQIP programs, and research has found that most farmers who plant cover crops do not use the cost share program. So we wanted to investigate that in the West. We first asked, are you aware of this USDA EQIP program? And you can see in the yellow that 61% said no. So you can't really participate in a program if you're first not even aware of it. So our results mirror other research in that manner. Next, we ask if you are aware of the program, how many years have you participated? And you can see that the next large pie on this, the largest pie on this pie chart is 0 years at 56%. So these were the farmers that were aware of it. They indicated, well, I've never really participated, 0 years. The next largest pie is in pink, which is only at 1 to 3 years, and that's at 17%. So in order to, if we think back to our barriers, with too expensive being the #1 barrier, how can we help solve that gap of, okay, if farmers are saying the #1 barrier is too expensive, but we're not participating in the EQIP program, how can we fill that gap and minimize it? So learning about some of the barriers is important to the EQIP program. So we did ask a follow-up question and a follow-up open-ended question. Okay, if you're aware of it and you've participated, whether it was 0 years to some years, can you identify any barriers with this program? And the large majority in the gray box on the left said none. So many of the producers said none. We can hypothesize that that's likely the 56% who said they participated 0 years, meaning They've never participated. So for this follow-up question, they said no barriers. I don't know, I haven't participated. But those who did have some familiarity with the program, the barriers they indicated were flexibility. And this had a lot to do with, I want my own seed mix, but I'm required to use the specified NRCS seed mix, was a few complaints I saw in this follow-up question. We also saw flexibility with the contract and planting dates. It seemed that if Mother Nature shifted anything for the farmer, then it made it hard for them to shift the contract and the working with NRCS and that existing program they had, or contract they had set in place. So just expressing the need for it to be more flexible, not only with seed mixes and perhaps planting dates and things like that. The next one was paperwork, which has followed similar research where they've said paperwork's a big deal. I don't really want to add more data collection than I already do, so we can understand that. Staff still learning was another theme that I saw frequently, and this had a lot to do with NRCS potentially being understaffed in some locations. I know working for Extension for over 10 years and knowing, you know, Extension can be understaffed. These agencies can be understaffed, and a lot of these staff and faculty are wearing many hats. So it's hard for us to constantly provide the hand-holding that we'd like to for every farmer to see the success of them and following through with a new program that they're unfamiliar with, or for the ability for the staff to be able to market and provide that outreach. Sometimes that's the last thought in underfunded situations. So that's something to consider, and I know we'll be hearing from some experts in NRCS through this webinar. So I'm just relaying what was found in this survey and how we might be able to use that information to improve any of the policy that can be improved in the program. Waiting time was another scenario that was mentioned a couple times, meaning they might have applied, but they really didn't find out if they got it until late in the growing season. And, you know, as a farmer, you really want to know when you're planting, you want to have the seeds available. So when that planting date hits, you want as much lead time to have all your ducks in a row, especially if sourcing seed is a barrier. That would be a huge issue. If you're wondering, am I planting, am I not? Did I get that cost share program awarded or not? So that was a similar theme. And then NRCS needing more resources, and that kind of falls in line to what I already mentioned. So another interesting thing to look at is just what industries in the Pacific Northwest are using cover crops the most, as opposed to which industries might be using it the least. Now I honed in on my left-hand side of the production systems that were mentioned in the Pacific Northwest with a value of over 30, meaning 30 or more farmers fell into one of these categories. And essentially, I just looked at the proportion of those that said they were using cover crops. And our number one is seed crops at 92%. We could hypothesize that that's likely cover crop seed producers. And knowing that we're in one of the largest cover crop seed producing regions, that those producers are very familiar with cover crops and they're obviously using cover crops. Next is processed vegetables at 89%. So that's pretty high, very high. We have fruit at 84%. 84% of grain producers in the Pacific Northwest are using cover crops. 83% for forage crops and pasture, which I thought was a surprising result. We think forage crops and pasture can be a little bit challenging to do cover crops in, or a new kind of a new tier of it. And so it was nice to see that that was a high value. Beef and dairy was at 82%. Market vegetables were at 81%, and I'm not familiar with those cropping systems as much, so I'm not sure if someone in this region is familiar to why processed vegetables might have a higher rate of cover crop use than market vegetables. And then other small animals was the lowest at 72%. And other small animals included sheep, pigs, and rabbits. I had another category for poultry, so essentially other small animals was sheep and swine. Now, one final question I asked on the survey, which I thought would be nice to present today, was Is there anything about cover crops you want to know more about? Because here's the Western Cover Crop Council. Again, the point of this survey was to not only to get some baseline data, but to also know where do we need to go next with research and outreach. So I think this is an interesting slide just to show what people were willing to type in. Again, this was not an easily fillable question. So again, if they're going to go the extra mile to type in at the very end of a survey, it's clearly something they're interested in and need to know more information about. So essentially I coded all of those responses and I grouped them, and here were the top groups. And you can see the size of the circle indicates the number of responses that fell under that category. Where on the left-hand side, we can see species selection being the number one. Many people are still wondering, okay, what if I'm going to go to the effort to do this? I want to have the most success. What species and what mixtures work best for me? And I know working in Idaho, we definitely wanted to hone in on what mixtures work best under the different conditions in Idaho. And I think that's something a theme to take home is understanding that site-specific information is going to be important for these producers. The second large category was overall management. People still wanting, okay, cover crops are a new management technique that I'm adding, and there's a lot to it. It's not just one thing. How do I overall management? Kind of what's an overall formula I should be using that should work for me? Maybe breaking it up in steps, because it can be overwhelming when you're new to cover crops, trying to even just get your foot in the water. First identifying the species, when to plant, what type of equipment you're going to need, all that. Next is, how does it benefit my farm? Many farmers might still be skeptical of how is it benefiting my farm. And maybe that's looking at soil health test and helping farmers see on a more yearly or every other year basis, maybe they're observing some differences, or maybe they're not, but it might be nice to have some tests that help them really see if they are having a difference, and that kind of adds that confidence of, oh yeah, I'm going to keep doing this practice. The next one was crop and location specific. So that kind of goes back to the first two as to really helping farmers with certain cropping systems and in certain locations figure out what type of species or mix works best and what type of management formula works best for that region. Next was pest. Planting in dry conditions, which we shouldn't be surprised about, but clearly that's something to hone in on, and then timing. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up with a quick conclusion slide, just summarizing those general results we found from this survey. We can say that 72% of farmers in the West say they use cover crops or have used them before. We see even higher percent for the Pacific Northwest at 79% of farmers saying they use cover crops. The top two motivators are increasing soil health and reducing soil erosion. And that's also the top two motivators overall for the entire survey response: soil health and reducing soil erosion. Helping farmers deal with global climate change was the least motivator for the Pacific Northwest producers. Now, barriers, the top two barriers overall for this survey were cover crops are too expensive and I lack the knowledge. And EQIP is a cost share program that is underutilized, but yet farmers say cover crops are too expensive. So what are ways we can help the program out? How can we inform farmers about this program if that's an issue, to minimize that gap so that we can see that number go from 72% all the way up to 95, 100% of farmers in the West using cover crops. And with that, I will hand it back to the host.
All right, thanks, Lauren.